So after my T470S video, I started to realize for most people, old laptops actually perform really well for basic tasks. So I just wanted to see how much laptop you could get for only $100. So I set myself a budget of $100 and ended up with this, a ThinkPad T430. Best part, this only cost me $75. So first impressions, I'm just gonna say this now. This is a 10-year-old laptop. This was released in 2012. So it has been moved around, beat up, and like all 10-year-olds I've ever known, probably stepped on once or twice in its life. So with that out of the way, this has held up way better than I would have ever thought for such an old laptop, especially after some nice cleaning and some polishing with the Magic Eraser. Seriously, if you have an old ThinkPad, try this. Like, it looks really good afterwards. I mean, this thing is in really good shape. I used to work with used electronics, and a lot of the 10-year-old laptops were just in such horrible condition when we received them. They were just hardly really worth anything. And even a lot of the T430s I was looking at just to buy were in really rough shape. So it's not like this is some impossible mystical piece of plastic that is indestructible like Nintendonium or whatever. But this specific laptop has held up really, really well over its life. And the overall body itself is built really well as well, with the wear and tear as you'd normally expect. The lid had a little bit of sticker wear, the keyboard had a little bit of wear, the screen had a little bit of wear on it. Nothing too crazy, some minor scratches and dings. And mine came with a 500GB hard drive, which I initially replaced with a $12 SSD that was on sale to keep the budget, but that went into my server, so I just took another SSD I had lying around, threw it in here. It's definitely not as well put together as a modern laptop, especially regarding the tolerances and the general fitment of it, especially this lid latch, which has so much play. I would almost rather it just not be there at all. Honestly, I just wish it wasn't there. I'm not sure why they included a lid latch. Maybe someone in the comments can enlighten me on what reasons this has for existing, because I just don't understand the point of this feature. But besides that, this is a pretty standard laptop, even though it's 10 years old. This honestly really caught me off guard when I started using this, and I burst out into laughing when I tried to use the backlit keyboard. Anyways, the keys are really nice to type on. They're just satisfying, but they can definitely be strange for someone who's used to modern low profile like chiclet keyboards. Even with that, I still absolutely love typing on it though, even if it is on the bulkier side. But it definitely doesn't impress my girlfriend when I pull it out to get some work done before bed. I wouldn't switch to this behemoth just for the keyboard, especially with how bulky this thing is, but I really did enjoy using it. And it also has some major portage going on, especially compared to Lenovo's modern ThinkPad T-Series. On the right, you've got a USB-A, express card slot, DVD drive, ooh, fancy, and full-size SD card reader. Oh yeah. So sick of modern laptops not having full-size SD card slots. Anyways, on the left, you got 2 more USB ports, a mini display port, and a VGA port if you're feeling extra retro. Oh, and a headphone jack. Then lastly, even more ports, the back has Gigabit Ethernet and one more USB, plus a proprietary charging port. Overall, I really miss the days before laptop manufacturers just hated us for some reason, but I also like the thinness, so whatever. So it's built well. Some would even argue built better than modern ThinkPads since it has lasted this long and is frankly in better shape than one of my T470Ss. But how is it to use? Well, it is very familiar and not at the same time. It has a standard track point, but I wasn't indoctrinated into the pointology cult at a young enough age, so trackpads are my preference generally. And if you're like me, then pack your mouse because this has a tiny trackpad. It's usable, don't get me wrong, but it is not great. On the bright side, from what I've seen online, the surface of the trackpad is actually replaceable if you don't like this weird grippy surface and want something better, but it's still tiny, it's not very intuitive, and you also can't use finger gestures for things like switching desktops or even just scrolling, which is a deal breaker for me personally, because I normally have 2 to 3 virtual desktops on my laptop at pretty much all times. But if you have a mouse or prefer the track point, I don't really think that's going to be too much of an issue for you, especially because this laptop isn't actually missing out on too much. It works for streaming video, writing in Word docs, basic browsing online. The screen is, well, it's 720p and it's just not good. The TN panel has horrible viewing angles. It's worse than pretty much any screen I've ever used in the past few years. I mean, it does work. It's somewhat bright, maybe not during the day, but it is somewhat bright. And the black levels can only be described as maybe light gray, and it's bad, but I'll get back to that. In terms of Adobe, I wasn't able to install the needed Intel drivers to properly use the Adobe suite, but I was able to ignore the error, so it must not be that important. And the last negative thing I will say about it is the Wi-Fi adapter is terrible, frankly. My camera monitor battery actually died while I was waiting for like basic file transfers from my server and like program downloads, which normally is never an issue in prior laptop videos. It just works with my Wi-Fi. And it also has speakers. The great thing is they are just as good as the T470S speakers. And the bad thing is they are just as good as the T470S speakers. They're not great. I don't know. They work. That's all I can say about ThinkPad speakers from the ones I've looked at. They work. You can hear stuff on it. They don't have much bass. They're not very clear. They don't sound good, but they work. And the battery actually lasted longer than I would have thought, but it really doesn't last all that long. At the end of the day, I got maybe 2 to 3 hours out of mine personally from pretty basic tasks. I'm not sure how old my battery is, but it is getting close to really only holding 50 to 60% of its original charge. So with a new battery, you should be able to get between maybe 4 and 6 hours of life doing basic tasks. I will say though, third-party batteries for these things are absolutely dirt cheap on eBay. Plus, the battery is super easily swappable without tools. So if you want, you can just carry a few of these around, and if you need to use your laptop all day, it's a major inconvenience. But if you just want to swap through all your batteries as you work in a coffee shop and restart your computer every time, that is a pretty major inconvenience though, especially coming from my T14, which can easily last me all day on a single charge. So, all right, you may be thinking, videos work fine, all right, whatever. But what about all the things that I do, a real person does, like play Command & Conquer Red Alert 2 and make memes with Photoshop CS4? Well, let me tell you, that is a really odd and specific example and use case, but you are probably fine. For photo and video editing, well, no, basically. Premiere isn't really keen on doing much of anything above 1/8 res, and Lightroom, I couldn't even get to import photos to begin editing. Maybe my specific laptop has some weird driver issues that I can't explain, but more likely this poor CPU has just seen its fair share of action and is ready to retire. And the CPU, I mean, it also showed its age from just spiking near to 100%. Just felt like installing programs, games, even unzipping small files took forever. So overall, in terms of raw power, you're really going to be lacking, but it's not to the point of being unusable. You know, maybe just take a chill pill, relax while your files are unzipping. You know, are those few seconds really that important to your overall life? Gaming, well, on the CPU mine came with, you're not getting much gaming in. I know, shocking. Yeah, you can play like maybe some FTL, the basics, NES, SNES, GBA, DS. Portal 2 also ran shockingly well, along with like Half-Life, most likely because we are limited to 720p because of the screen, but it really doesn't look that bad at all, honestly, and you can crank up the settings, fortunately. You can also play like Fallout New Vegas somewhat well, or 3 if you can get it to stop crashing with Windows 10. Dolphin works well as well for GameCube games, maybe not Wii, but it did have some kind of stuttering for me in some games, and PCSX2 won't even open. It, don't know. Past that, you're really just going to be hitting a wall, honestly, and we'll get back to this too. In terms of artificial testing, I only ran Cinebench R23, but it did score a 1510, which to be honest is a little bit sad, but I won't make fun of the little guy. What did surprise me though is actually how similarly it compared to the more modern i7 1165G7. Because while the actual overall performance was pretty far apart, the single core performance was pretty similar. And one last thing on using this laptop, it is actually very quiet and has no problems cooling the current CPU in it. And honestly, I'm just really surprised by how quiet this laptop is. Even under artificial load, which, okay, let's just talk about it. You can upgrade this laptop. Not in the new pansy way reviewers are praising modern laptops, where you can swap in 2 M.2 SSDs and pretend that's some marvel of modern engineering. No, you can upgrade the RAM, hard drive, SSD, cooling system, screen, DVD drive for some reason, and even the CPU itself. I have heard of people swapping out the main boards with ones that have the GPUs, but in my opinion, that really doesn't count because you can swap out the main board with most laptops. I don't know. So to keep with the $100 budget, I went over by $30 and bought a new CPU. This is an Intel i7-3540M. It was $38.51 total off of eBay, and we're gonna go ahead and throw it in this guy. So actually upgrading the CPU wasn't quite as easy as upgrading a desktop CPU, obviously, but I will say it wasn't too bad. Once I got over the initial confusion shared by the guy who made my tutorial I was watching when I couldn't get the plastic on the top to pull off, I just had to take a bunch of screws off the back, take the keyboard off, forget to take more stuff off, take that stuff off, and then the CPU heatsink is right here. And after a little bit of cleanup, it was just as simple as removing the heatsink cable, then popping off the heatsink and taking the CPU out. Although I will say, it is a PGA CPU, so be careful with the pins if you do this yourself. After that, you just plop the new one in, forget the thermal paste, put that on, put it all back together with only one missing screw, and then afterwards, make sure your trackpad stops working like mine, and then think you got scammed on your CPU until you reset your laptop and it fixes itself. And lastly, this is the most important step. Remember to smack the pins on your old CPU with your camera lens while doing B-roll and bend the pins. So not only do you damage your new camera lens, you also damage your $10 CPU. Will say though, while I did only upgrade the i5 dual core to an i7 dual core, you can step it up to as much as an Extreme Edition quad core, but you will need to upgrade the cooling system to handle it. But if you do want to do any sort of like video editing or maybe heavier photo editing, animation, maybe don't do 3D modeling on this, moving up to a quad-core i7 will most likely be your best and only option though. That will cost you around $100 for the CPU alone though, doubling the cost of this laptop with just a CPU. But if CPUbenchmark.net is somewhat to be believed, this will outperform a T470S with an i7 7600U, which those typically go for about $200 to $250 for the whole laptop. So similar pricing. You can work out a way to throw an eGPU into the mix if you're a little bit more savvy and want to dive into that, but that's not the main point of this video. But I also do want to see if I can throw together a cheap ThinkPad CPU with an eGPU. I wrote most of this script pre-CPU upgrade because I did not think the CPU would do too much more than make the laptop a little bit more snappy and whatever. But it actually made a pretty decent difference, even with a small upgrade. Lightroom actually started to work, thankfully, and it was pretty usable overall. Premiere, however, was still pretty much unusable. Even with the low quality proxies, 4K footage was just too far out of reach for this poor dual-core 10-year-old i7. In terms of games, well, most perform pretty similarly. But Fallout New Vegas can run at medium settings and pretty much stay at a steady 60 FPS. Dolphin for me had some minor stutters here and there that appear to be gone now, although native resolution is still pretty much going to be where you're stuck at. PCSX2 still won't launch at all without downgrading to an older version, so the very basic gaming this can do really didn't improve much. If it could do it before, it could do it now, and if it couldn't do it before, it still pretty much can't do it now. Although I will say the overall system feels much more responsive with the new CPU, and I would honestly, if you're getting one of these, highly suggest trying to squeeze that extra $30 out for a slightly better CPU. Or if you can, spring for a lower end quad core if you can afford it, because the only other way to get a quad core and a T-Series ThinkPad is going to be moving all the way up to a T480. So while I didn't test battery much, I'm sure it's worse. Let's just be honest. And my fan is louder than it was previously, so it's a little bit less quiet, but you can always upgrade the cooling system. And I think my fan bearing is starting to go bad anyways. Even with this current stock cooling setup, it was still pretty quiet and the CPU was able to keep pretty stable temps, even with artificial load. So now, while I only upgraded my CPU on this just to kind of keep it within that $100 budget I was aiming for, there are a lot of things you can do to this laptop to just make it your own and upgrade it. You really can make this laptop your own. You can put a new keyboard, screen. Like I said before, you can upgrade the cooling system. If the fan goes bad, it's super easy to replace it, so you don't have to worry about it just being loud and obnoxious. If you're more interested in the specifics of modding or you plan on picking one of these up yourself, I would highly suggest looking up the definitive T430 modding guide, linked in the description. It seems to be like the go-to for T430 modding, and it is very well put together with a lot of great information that would take me way too long to cover in this video and just be outside the scope of it. So I really think if you're in a tight spot money-wise and you need a laptop now and want something you can slowly throw some money at over time, kind of like a desktop, this is pretty much the best and only way to go. It's not the prettiest, it's not the fastest, but damn, is there some serious value here. And there's also some serious nerd credibility. If I saw someone using one of these in public, I would be seriously impressed and then return back to typing on my, I swear this was a T495 yesterday.